Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're diving into something truly fascinating. We're going to unpack a highly intricate, literally mathematical timeline that's been pulled directly from ancient texts. Specifically, we're looking at a super detailed breakdown by Alan Dubé over at the Revealing Revelation channel. So let's just jump right into this explainer and see exactly how he constructs this incredibly precise prophecy equation.
You know, for years, a lot of folks who observe biblical timelines thought a very specific 70-year prophetic window had firmly closed back in 2018. But Dubé suggests a completely different mathematical reality, one that actually pinpoints the year 2026. Now, today, we're going to impartially unpack the complex scriptural math the source uses to land on that exact year. We aren't here to endorse the theology, right? We're just here to dive into the logic and solve the math step by step, exactly as it's presented in the source material.
Okay, here's our roadmap to decoding the 2026 prophecy. Step 1, the 70-year mystery. Step 2, mapping 14 prophetic years. Step 3, Zechariah's biblical blueprint. And finally, Step 4, calculating the year 2026. Let's solve this giant equation piece by piece. Step 1, the 70-year mystery, finding the missing variable. The whole foundation of this timeline starts over in the book of Psalms. The text reads, "The days of our years are 70, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off." Now, what's super fascinating here is the mathematical interpretation of this. Dubé translates the phrase labor and sorrow to mean exactly 10 years of tribulation. Add the short period right before being cut off, which he estimates at about 6 months, and boom, we have our very first variable, a baseline of 10.5 years.
Moving on to Step 2, mapping 14 prophetic years, adding up the timeline.
To get the next variable in our equation, the source pulls a really crucial piece from Revelation 12:14. It describes a woman being nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. The channel translates this phrase directly into numbers. So a time is 1, times is 2, and half a time is, well, a half. Add those up, 1 plus 2 plus a half, and that gives us exactly 3.5 years of fleeing. All right, let's put these puzzle pieces together. We start with our first variable, that 10.5 years of sorrow we just derived from Psalms. Next up, we add our second variable. That's the 3.5 years of wilderness fleeing we just extracted from Revelation. When you add 10.5 to 3.5, you get exactly 14 years. This gives us 14 solid years of prophetic tribulation. And the source makes a point of highlighting that this 14-year framework perfectly aligns with the timelines mentioned by the Apostle Paul over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, across these 14 years, the source plots some highly specific milestones. By cross-referencing 1 Kings chapter 6, a physical building timeline actually emerges. In year 4, the temple foundation is laid. Then, fast forward to year 10.5, or the 11th year, and the temple is finished, which totally coincides with Satan being cast down. Finally, the whole thing culminates in year 14. So as you can see, this 14-year framework isn't just arbitrary. It is densely packed with highly structured events. All right, step 3, Zechariah's biblical blueprint. Chapters equal years. Okay, so we have our 14 years, but how does the source actually prove this sequence is correct? Well, enter the primary multiplier. To validate this timeline, Dubé uses a really unique methodology he calls chapters to years. It's a prophetic interpretation method where the actual chapter number of a biblical book directly correlates to a specific prophetic year. The book of Zechariah just happens to have exactly 14 chapters, and the source proposes that the events described in each of those chapters map perfectly, literally one-to-one, onto the 14-year timeline for Jerusalem that we just mapped out. Let's see how this actually plays out in the text. In Zechariah chapter 4, which corresponds to prophetic year 4, the text talks about the foundation of the temple being laid by Zerubbabel. Skip ahead to chapter 8, which is year 8, and the text describes hands being made strong to resume rebuilding that temple. Then, in chapter 11, aligning with year 11, the text describes a covenant being broken and a cutoff occurring, and that aligns perfectly with the beast entering the completed temple. It's wild. The events in these chapters perfectly mirror the 14-year timeline we saw earlier. But you might be wondering, what triggers this entire 14-year sequence in the first place? Well, if we apply this chapters to years rule backwards all the way to chapter 1, we find our answer. Zechariah chapter 1 mentions indignation against Judah and Jerusalem for, quote, these 70 years.
The source points out that this establishes a 70-year countdown that absolutely must occur right before the 14-year tribulation timeline even begins. So our next job is to find out exactly when those 70 years actually started.
Which brings us to step 4, calculating the year 2026, solving the equation.
To count 70 years, we obviously need a starting line. The source uses a very specific historical anchor date for this, the spring of 1950. That's the momentous occasion when Jerusalem was officially declared the capital of Israel. But wait a second, if you do the math in your head and just add 70 years to 1950, you get 2020. So how on earth does the channel reach 2026?
Well, the answer lies in what we can call the Leviticus modifier. The source explains that you don't just do a simple straight count. Step 1 is starting at that 1950 declaration. But step 2 requires applying an Old Testament agricultural mystery from Leviticus chapter 19. That rule mandates adding 5 years of waiting after entering the land. Then step 3 adds 1 more year for the actual planting of the trees. So that total of 6 added years pushes our true base starting year from 1950 all the way to 1956. Now we finally have all the variables to solve this giant equation. We start with our adjusted base year of 1956. Then we add the prophetic duration of 70 years that we extracted from Zechariah. Interestingly enough, this 70-year period perfectly aligns with the famous 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, interpreting those weeks as 70 feasts of weeks. Running this final calculation projects a very specific target date, falling somewhere between Sivan 6 and Sivan 15 on the Hebrew calendar.
And when you take 1956 and add exactly 70 years to it, you get exactly 2026. This is just a fascinating illustration of how the source takes incredibly disparate texts. I mean, we're talking Psalms, Revelation, Kings, Zechariah, and Leviticus, and somehow weaves them all together into a single cohesive mathematical timeline, landing squarely on the year 2026.
Which leaves us with a pretty compelling final question, doesn't it? Will 2026 actually fulfill this highly intricate timeline, or is the math of prophecy always kind of a moving target? Whether you view this as divine revelation or simply a fascinating exercise in pattern recognition and numerical mapping, the sheer level of structure here is completely undeniable. It really challenges us to look closer at how ancient texts are interpreted and quantified in the modern age. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.